There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the clothes of a Tuesday evening or smell like leftover takeout, and they don't announce themselves with any kind of fanfare. They are quiet intruders, slipping through the unlocked doors of your routine, and it's only much, much later, when you're looking back, that you see them for what they were: fault lines. The subtle tremors that preceded the earthquake that would rearrange your entire world. For me, that moment was a rejection. A simple, self-protective word, no, spoken into the quiet of my own living room. It was a boundary I had spent years building, a wall I thought was immovable. And it was the moment Julian, my best friend, the singular and unwavering axis around which my life had secretly turned for a decade, decided to tear it all down. He had come to me as he always did, a ship seeking harbor from his own internal storm, and he had reached for me. I had turned away, and he, for the first time ever, had refused to let me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply closed the small space I had created between us, his hands finding my arms, not with anger, but with a terrifying, desperate certainty. He held me in place, his face close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, see the exhaustion and the fear and something else, something wild and unnameable, in his eyes. And he said, his voice a low tremor that vibrated through my entire skeleton, I wasn't asking. To understand the weight of those 3 words, you have to understand the silence they shattered. A silence we had cultivated for 10 years. Ever since we were freshmen on the college swim team, 2 boys treading water in the deep end of a new life. I met Julian on the first day of practice. He was all bright, kinetic energy, a supernova of easy smiles and loud laughter that drew people into his orbit effortlessly. He moved with a loose-limbed confidence that I, with my quiet corners and observant nature, had always envied. I was a photographer even then, more comfortable behind a lens than in the center of a room, and my world was a series of carefully composed frames. Julian wasn't a frame. He was a blur of motion, a chaotic and beautiful variable I could never quite capture. We were paired in the same lane, a coincidence of alphabetical order that felt, in retrospect, like the hand of fate giving me a firm, deliberate shove. For hours every day, we swam side by side, our bodies moving in a synchronized rhythm, separated only by a thin, floating lane line. That line felt like a metaphor for our entire friendship. We were close, impossibly close, sharing the same water, the same exhaustion, the same chlorine-scented air, but always with that one, clear boundary between us. Our friendship was forged in those early mornings, in the shared agony of ice baths and the breathless exhaustion after a hard set. He was the one who would sling a wet arm over my shoulders and drag me to the dining hall, chattering about a class or a girl he'd met, filling the silences I so naturally created. I was the one he came to when he needed to study, knowing I'd have my notes organized and a quiet corner of the library already claimed. I became his anchor, his point of stillness in a life lived at full speed. And he, without ever knowing it, became my everything. It happened slowly, then all at once, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom. A faint image emerging from the chemical bath, gradually gaining clarity and contrast until it's the only thing you can see. For me, it was the way the afternoon light would catch the gold flecks in his brown eyes, or the specific, unguarded way he'd smile when he was truly happy, a rare and genuine thing that was different from his public, charming grin. It was the sound of his laugh, a full-throated bark that could make my own chest ache with a feeling I didn't dare name. I started taking pictures of him. Not posed portraits, but stolen moments. Julian, asleep on a pile of textbooks in the library, a line of drool on his cheek. Julian, mid-laugh, head thrown back, a picture of pure, unadulterated joy. Julian, staring out over the water from the starting block, his face a mask of intense focus, the muscles in his back a perfect anatomical map. I told myself it was for my portfolio. An exercise in capturing the human form, in documenting life. It was a lie, of course. A beautiful, necessary lie. Each photograph was a secret love letter, a confession I could never speak aloud. I was building a museum of him, a private gallery where I was the only visitor, and I could love him safely from a distance, without ever risking the beautiful, fragile architecture of our friendship. College ended. We graduated and stepped out of the chlorinated bubble that had defined our lives. I pursued photography, a precarious path of freelance gigs and artistic grants, building a small life for myself in a city apartment filled with second-hand furniture and the smell of darkroom chemicals. Julian, ever the pragmatist, went into software consulting. It was a world of sharp suits and sharper deadlines, of airports and client dinners, and a salary that made my artist's income look like a rounding error. His kinetic energy was channeled into climbing a corporate ladder, and for a while, it seemed to suit him. He had a serious girlfriend, a lovely woman named Claire who was smart and kind and who looked at him with an adoration I recognized with a painful, intimate familiarity. I was happy for him. I had to be. I was his best friend. I went to their housewarming party. I listened to him talk about ring shopping. I perfected the art of the supportive smile, a mask that became more and more comfortable with each passing year. My love for him became a room inside my heart, a room I kept locked. I knew the layout by heart, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the walls, but I never opened the door. It was too dangerous. The foundation of our friendship was built on the unspoken assumption of my platonic affection. To confess would be to take a sledgehammer to that foundation, and I couldn't bear the thought of the whole structure coming down, of losing him entirely. So I stayed quiet. I remained his anchor, his port in any storm, the one constant in his increasingly hectic life. The first tremor in the tectonic plates of our lives came not as a single event, but as a slow, creeping erosion. It was the shift. Julian's job, the one that had seemed so shiny and full of promise, began to devour him. The projects became more demanding, the travel more relentless. He was living out of a suitcase, chasing time zones, his life a blur of rental cars and hotel rooms that all looked the same. He and Claire broke up. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow fade, a casualty of distance and divergent paths. He told me about it over the phone, his voice flat and tired, calling from a hotel in a city whose name he seemed to have forgotten. There was no heartbreak in his voice, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. I think, in a way, he was relieved. It was one less thing to have to pretend to maintain. After the breakup, the nature of his visits to my apartment began to change. Before, they were planned, scheduled events. Drinks Friday, want to catch a movie Saturday? Now, they became spontaneous acts of desperation. My doorbell would ring at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and he'd be standing there, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened, looking like a soldier who had just stumbled out of a war zone. He wouldn't even have to say anything. I'd just open the door wider, and he would walk in, shedding the armor of his corporate life at the threshold. He would collapse onto my worn-out sofa, the springs groaning in protest, and just be. He wouldn't talk about work, not really. He'd just stare at the ceiling, the frantic energy that had once defined him now replaced by a leaden stillness. I would make him tea, or pour him a whiskey, and sit in the armchair across from him, the quiet observer, just as I had always been. We would sit in a comfortable, familiar silence, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the distant city traffic. I was his decompression chamber. My small, cluttered apartment was the only place he didn't have to perform, the only place he could let the mask of competence and control finally slip. I understood, without him ever having to say it, that he was drowning. Not in a dramatic, flailing way, but in the slow, quiet way a person drowns when they're too tired to keep swimming. He was adrift in the vast, lonely ocean of his life, and my apartment was his life raft. A small, sturdy, dependable thing to cling to in the dark. I didn't mind. I would have thrown myself into a hurricane for him. Giving him a quiet place to breathe was the easiest thing in the world. And then, the ritual began. It started innocently enough. It was one of those late nights. He was on my sofa, I was in my armchair, and we were watching some mindless documentary about deep-sea creatures. His flight had been delayed that day, and he'd come straight from the airport, looking frayed at the edges, his eyes shadowed with a fatigue that seemed bone-deep. Halfway through the film, I noticed his breathing had changed, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. His head had slumped to the side, resting against the arm of the sofa at an awkward, neck-cricking angle. I watched him for a long time, my heart doing a slow, painful thud in my chest. He looked so young, so vulnerable, all the sharp edges of his corporate persona sanded away by sleep. I got up quietly, fetched the worn quilt from the back of my armchair, and gently draped it over him. My fingers brushed against his hair as I tucked it around his shoulder, and a jolt, hot and electric, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. It was a dangerous, stupid thing to do, this small act of tenderness. It felt like a crack in the wall of my carefully constructed platonic fortress. I retreated to my bedroom that night with my heart pounding, leaving him there, a sleeping giant in the landscape of my living room. He woke up in the morning, disoriented, the quilt pooled around his waist. He just blinked at me as I was making coffee, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. "Sorry, man." I crashed. I just shrugged, my voice steadier than I felt. "You look tired," that was the pretext. The plausible deniability. "You look tired." It became our unspoken script. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, we were sitting on the sofa together, watching a movie. He had insisted on takeout, and we were crowded onto the cushions, containers balanced on our laps. As the movie wore on, I felt a subtle shift, a gradual leaning, until the side of his head was resting gently on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending was on high alert, screaming. I could feel the texture of his hair against my neck, the warmth of him seeping through my t-shirt. I didn't breathe. I didn't move a muscle. I sat there, a statue of barely contained panic and a dizzying, terrifying joy, until the credits rolled. He didn't stir. He was fast asleep, his body completely relaxed against mine. The weight of him was both a comfort and a torment. It was everything I had ever wanted, delivered in a package I wasn't allowed to open. I sat like that for another hour, my own muscles screaming in protest, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, just so I wouldn't have to wake him, just so I could steal a few more minutes of this impossible, ambiguous closeness. The ritual escalated. The sofa became a regular occurrence. He'd arrive, shed his work persona, and gravitate toward me, like a compass needle finding north. He stopped pretending he was there to watch a movie. Sometimes he'd just lie down, put his head in my lap, and close his eyes, sighing as my fingers would, after a moment of intense hesitation, find their way into his hair. It was an instinctive gesture, a soothing motion I didn't even think about, and it seemed to calm some deep restlessness in him. He would melt under my touch, his body going slack with a trust that both thrilled and terrified me. I was playing with fire, and I knew it. Each touch was a line crossed, a secret whispered into the dark. I was his friend, his straight, platonic best friend. This was not something friends did. But he was the one initiating it, wasn't he? He was the one leaning in, the one seeking the contact. He was the unknowing initiator, and I was the terrified accomplice, caught between the desire to give him the comfort he so clearly needed and the primal fear of what that comfort might mean. My internal monologue was a constant, looping debate. He's just tired. He's lonely. He doesn't mean anything by it. It's just physical comfort, like two puppies in a basket. Don't read into it. Don't you dare ruin this. But another voice, a quieter, more hopeful voice, would whisper, "But what if he does? What if this is his only way of asking for something he doesn't know how to name?" The move to the bedroom was the next great breach. He had been staying on my couch for 2 nights in a row after a particularly brutal work trip. On the third morning, he woke up groaning, rolling his shoulders and wincing. "Leo," he said, his voice rough with sleep, "I love you, but your couch is a medieval torture device. My back is killing me." I was standing in the kitchen doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee, and my heart stuttered at the casual, "I love you," a phrase he threw around easily, like a stone skipped across water, while for me it was a boulder I could barely lift. I tried to keep my voice light. It builds character. He wasn't smiling. He looked at me, his eyes serious. Would it be weird if I just crashed in your bed tonight? I promise I'll stay on my side. I just need a real mattress." The air in the room crackled. The question hung there between us, shimmering with unspoken possibilities. This was different. The couch was a public space, a gray area. A bed was a bed. It was a place of undeniable intimacy. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, a way to say no without revealing the sheer panic the suggestion induced. But looking at his exhausted face, the deep lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, I couldn't do it. How could I deny him sleep? How could I deny him comfort? "Yeah," I heard myself say, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "Sure. It's fine. Don't be weird about it." Don't be weird about it. The words were for him, but they were really for me. A desperate command to my own frantic heart. That night was one of the longest of my life. I lay on my side of the bed, my back to him, my body a rigid line of tension. I could feel his presence behind me, a field of heat and energy that seemed to warp the very air in the room. I could hear every breath he took, every rustle of the sheets as he shifted. My bed, my sanctuary, the most private space in my life, was no longer just mine. It was ours, and I didn't know how to exist in it. After what felt like an eternity of feigning sleep, I felt him move. He rolled over, and then there was a hesitant touch, his hand landing softly on my hip. It was a light, questioning touch. I froze, my entire being focused on that single point of contact. I waited for him to pull away, to realize what he was doing, to retreat back to his side. He didn't. Instead, his arm draped more fully over my waist, and he shuffled closer, his chest pressing against my back. His breath was warm on my neck. He was cuddling me, in my own bed. My carefully constructed walls, my fortress of platonic denial, crumbled into dust. There was no plausible deniability here. This was not an accident. This was not something you did with a friend you were just tired around. This was a deliberate act of seeking intimacy. And still, he said nothing. He just held me, his breathing slowly deepening back into the rhythm of sleep, leaving me wide awake in the dark, my world tilted on its axis, my heart beating a frantic, terrified, hopeful rhythm against my ribs. This became the new ritual. He no longer bothered with the couch. He would arrive, and his path through my apartment would end at my bedroom door. We didn't talk about it. We had created a new, unspoken agreement. My bed was our shared space. Some nights, he would just collapse onto his side and fall asleep immediately. But most nights, he would wait. He would wait for me to get into bed, to turn off the light, to settle. And then, in the darkness, he would move. He would shift closer, his arm would come around my waist, his face would tuck into the space between my shoulder blades, and he would hold me. He held me like a man clinging to a piece of driftwood in a vast, dark sea. And I, in turn, would lie there, a willing anchor, letting him hold me, while my own heart was a silent storm of confusion and longing. I learned the topography of his sleep, the way his fingers would sometimes twitch against my stomach, as if he were typing on a keyboard in his dreams. The soft, guttural sound he made in the back of his throat just before he drifted off. The way the tension would slowly leave his body, his muscles uncoiling until he was a dead weight against me, a weight that was both a burden and the most profound comfort I had ever known. I was living in a state of suspended animation, in a beautiful, terrifying dream I was afraid to wake from. I was so afraid that if I moved, if I spoke, if I even breathed wrong, the spell would be broken, and he would vanish. The crossing happened on a Sunday night. It had been a quiet weekend. For once, Julian hadn't had to travel. He'd spent most of it at my place, and a strange, domestic rhythm had settled over us. We'd bought groceries, I'd cooked, he'd done the dishes. It felt normal, dangerously normal. That evening, we were lying in bed, not yet trying to sleep, just existing in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. We were on our backs, side by side, staring at the ceiling. The silence between us wasn't tense. It was soft, pliable. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet. I turned my head to look at him. He was already looking at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Yeah. Can I ask you something weird?" My heart started its familiar, frantic drumming. This was the preamble. I had heard it in my head 1,000 times, the start of a conversation that would change everything. I could only nod, my throat suddenly tight. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the space between us on the mattress, then rising back to my eyes. The confidence that was so much a part of him was gone, replaced by a raw, breathtaking vulnerability. "Would it be okay," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The hum of the city outside my window faded away. My own breathing ceased. The question hung in the air, a perfect, fragile glass sculpture. It wasn't a proposition. It wasn't a drunken pass. It was a question of permission, steeped in a fear and a hope that mirrored my own. He was giving me an out. He was giving me the chance to say no, to retreat to the safety of our old friendship, to pretend he had never asked. I could have said, "Don't be weird, Julian." I could have laughed it off, made a joke. and the moment would have passed, leaving an awkward scar that would eventually fade. The locked room in my heart swung open on its hinges, and all the feelings I had kept hidden for a decade came flooding out. I didn't trust my voice, so I just looked at him, and I tried to pour all of my unspoken confessions, all my years of silent longing, into that single gaze. And then, slowly, I nodded. A single, deliberate motion. Yes. Relief washed over his face, so palpable it was like watching a tightly coiled spring finally release. He didn't lunge for me. He moved with an agonizing slowness, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He raised a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His touch was tentative, questioning. And then he leaned in, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie scene kiss. It was soft. It was hesitant. It was unbelievably gentle. It was a question and a statement and an apology all at once. It was the taste of whiskey and salt and 10 years of unspoken words. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. His forehead rested against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. I could feel a slight tremor in his hand, which was still cupping my face. Neither of us spoke. The silence that returned was different. It wasn't the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of things finally understood. He had crossed the line, the one I had been so terrified of, and the world hadn't ended. The ground hadn't split open beneath us. Instead, it felt like something had finally, after years of being misaligned, clicked into place. He kissed me again, and this time it was firmer, more certain. And I kissed him back, my hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath my palm, a rhythm that matched my own. We stayed like that for a long time, lost in a new territory of quiet kisses and shared breaths, redrawing the map of our world. When we finally broke apart, he rolled onto his side, facing me, and pulled me into the familiar curve of his body. But this time, when his arm came around me, it wasn't the desperate grasp of a drowning man. It was a sure, steady embrace. He tucked my head under his chin, his lips brushing against my hair. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "Okay." And for the first time in years, I fell asleep in his arms without a single shred of anxiety, only a profound, earth-shattering peace. The peace, of course, was a false dawn. I woke the next morning to an empty bed. The space beside me was cold. I sat up, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I could hear the shower running. A few minutes later, Julian emerged from the bathroom, already dressed in the clothes he'd worn the day before. He wouldn't look at me. He was a whirlwind of frantic, avoidant energy, gathering his wallet, his keys, his phone. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse. "You're up early." He glanced at me, a quick, fleeting look, his face a shuttered mask. "Yeah, early meeting. Have to run." He was already at the bedroom door. "Julian, wait," I said, getting out of bed. "About last night." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. "Can we not?" he said, his voice sharp. "I'm late. I'll call you." And then he was gone. The front door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that filled the apartment was no longer peaceful. It was hollow. It was loud. It was the sound of a beautiful, fragile thing shattering into a million pieces. He didn't call. Not that day, not the next. My texts went unanswered, delivered but unread. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth, taking the fragile hope he had built inside me with him. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing descent into a very specific kind of hell. The hell of being given everything you've ever wanted, only to have it snatched away without explanation. The silence from him was a physical presence in my apartment. The bed felt cavernous and cold. The sofa mocked me. Every corner of my home was haunted by the ghost of his presence and the ghost of what had happened between us. My internal monologue, once a debate, was now a vicious cycle of self-recrimination. "You fool. You absolute fool. You misread everything. You were a convenience. A warm body. A moment of weakness for him. And you let yourself believe it was more. He's freaked out. He's disgusted. You've ruined everything. You've lost your best friend." The hope that had bloomed so brightly just a few nights before withered and died, leaving a bitter, toxic residue. The pain was worse than the years of silent longing, because now I knew what I was missing. I had tasted it. I had held it in my arms. and it was gone. The locked room in my heart, the one I had kept sealed for so long, was now a gaping, raw wound. After 3 days of radio silence, my despair began to curdle into a slow-burning anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, for being so willing to take my comfort but so unwilling to face the consequences of his own actions. And anger at myself for being so willing to let him. He showed up on the fourth night. It was late, past midnight. The doorbell rang, a shrill, jarring sound in the oppressive quiet of my apartment. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic, panicked bird. I looked through the peephole, and there he was. He looked worse than I had ever seen him. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was swaying slightly on his feet. He hadn't just come from work. He'd come from a bar. I opened the door, my body rigid with a cold, protective anger. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, blocking the entrance. He looked at me, his face a mess of exhaustion and regret, and something that looked horribly like fear. "Leo," he slurred slightly. Can I come in?" For a moment, I almost gave in. The instinct to care for him, to pull him inside and fix whatever was broken, was so deeply ingrained in me it felt like a part of my own DNA. But the hurt was too fresh, the wound too raw. I had to protect myself. I had spent years building walls to keep my heart safe from him, and he had just spent 3 days proving why those walls were necessary. "No," I said, my voice flat and cold. "No, Julian. I don't think that's a good idea." He blinked, as if my refusal was a language he didn't understand. He had never been told no at this door before. This was his sanctuary, his safe harbor. He couldn't comprehend being denied entry. "Leo, please," he said, his voice cracking. I need to." He took a stumbling step forward, his arms coming up as if to hug me, an instinctive reach for the familiar comfort he always found here. It was that gesture, that automatic, unthinking reach for my body, that made something inside me snap. It was the final insult. After days of silence, after leaving me to believe our kiss was a mistake he deeply regretted, he thought he could just show up, drunk and broken, and fall back into our old routine? That he could use my body as a charging station for his own emotional needs without a single word of explanation? "No," I said again, louder this time, and I took a step back, putting a definitive space between us. I crossed my arms over my chest, a physical barrier. "We're not doing this anymore, Julian. You don't get to do this. You don't get to kiss me and then disappear for 4 days and then show up here expecting this." My voice shook with a fury I hadn't known I possessed. "Whatever this is, it's over." A look of sheer panic washed over his face. He saw the wall I had rebuilt, higher and stronger than before. He saw me retreating, closing the door he had so briefly and beautifully opened. And he panicked. He reached for me again, not for a hug this time, but to stop me. To stop me from closing that final door in his face. It was in this moment, this terrible, fraught intersection of my hurt and his desperation, that the world shifted. I had already begun to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of my apartment and shut him out for good. But he was faster. He closed the distance between us in a single, desperate stride, his hands clamping down on my upper arms, halting my retreat. His grip wasn't brutal, but it was unyielding. It was the grip of a man terrified of being left alone. He pinned my arms to my sides, not to hurt me, but to hold me there, to force me to face him. I struggled for a second, a reflexive jolt of surprise and anger, but he held firm. His face was inches from mine, his eyes wild and pleading. I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath, but underneath it, I could smell the familiar scent of him, a scent that was tied to a decade of my deepest and most secret feelings. It was into this maelstrom of anger, fear, and shattered hope that he spoke the words that would become the new foundation of our world. His voice was a raw, broken whisper, a plea from the very depths of his unraveling soul. I wasn't asking. The words hung in the air, electric and terrifying. They weren't a command. They weren't an assertion of power. They were a confession of need. A raw, stripped-down admission that he was past the point of polite requests. He was drowning, and he was telling me, in the only way he knew how, that he couldn't let go of his lifeline. My anger, so hot and righteous just a second before, evaporated, replaced by the familiar, aching pull of my love for him. I stopped struggling. I just looked at him, at the absolute devastation in his eyes, and saw past my own hurt to the profound terror that was driving him. He was terrified, not of me, but of what he felt, of what he had done, of what it all meant. His grip on my arms loosened, his hands sliding down to my wrists, his thumbs stroking the frantic pulse points there. And then his facade crumbled completely. His forehead dropped to my shoulder, and a sound, a ragged, guttural sob, was torn from his chest. His whole body shuddered against mine. He wasn't holding me in place anymore. He was clinging to me, and all the fight went out of me. My arms, now free, came up and wrapped around his shaking frame, pulling him closer, holding him together as he fell apart in my doorway. We stood like that for a long time, just inside the threshold of my apartment, the door still wide open to the hallway. He wept. He wept with the force of a man who had been holding back a flood for years. He cried for his loneliness, for his confusion, for his fear, and for the 4 days of cowardly silence that had nearly cost him everything. I just held him, my cheek pressed against his hair, my own tears silently tracking down my face. Tears of relief, of forgiveness, of a pain so deep it had looped back around to a kind of cathartic peace. When his sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he pulled back just enough to look at me, his face blotchy and wet, his eyes raw. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry. I'm an idiot. I'm a coward. Why, Julian?" I asked, my own voice barely a whisper. "Why did you run?" He shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust. "Because I was scared. I've been running on fumes for so long, and you're the only thing that felt real. The only place I felt safe. And I relied on that. I took it for granted. I used your friendship, your kindness, as a crutch." He took a ragged breath. "And then I kissed you. And it wasn't a mistake. It was the only thing I've done in a year that felt like a choice I was actually making for myself. And it terrified me, because it was real. And it meant everything had to change. And I didn't know what that meant for us. For me." He looked away, staring at the floor, shame written in every line of his body. "I've spent my whole life being what everyone expected me to be. The jock, the good son, the ambitious consultant, the straight guy with a nice girlfriend. It's all a script, and I'm a good actor. But with you, I've never had to act. And when I kissed you, it was like I was finally admitting that the script was wrong. That the person I am when I'm with you, that's the real me. And the real me is in love with my best friend. And I didn't know how to be that person. So I ran. I tried to go back to the script, but it was empty. The words didn't make sense anymore." He finally met my gaze again, his eyes clear and sober despite the alcohol. "These last 4 days have been the worst of my life. Because the one person I needed to talk to about how terrified I was of my feelings for him was you. And I had thrown that away. I came here tonight to beg you to forgive me, to just let me back in, even as just a friend. Because the thought of my life without you in it, it's not a life. It's just empty space." He reached up and cupped my face, his touch as gentle as it had been the night of the kiss. "I love you, Leo. Not in the casual way I've always said it. I mean, I am in love with you. And it scares the hell out of me. But not as much as the thought of losing you." All the air left my lungs in a rush. There it was. The confession I had dreamed of hearing for a decade, spoken not in a perfect, romantic moment, but here, in the harsh light of my hallway, born from a place of desperation and fear. It was messy. It was complicated. It was painfully, beautifully real. "I love you too," I said, the words finally breaking free. I have for years. A small, watery smile touched his lips. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Yeah," he breathed. "I kind of started to figure that out." He leaned in and kissed me, and this kiss was different from all the others. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't desperate. It was a promise, a beginning. It was the taste of salt and apologies and a future I had never let myself believe was possible. I kissed him back, pouring every ounce of my forgiveness, my relief, and my own decade of love into it. When we finally broke apart, I took his hand and led him inside, closing and locking the door behind us. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was a definitive, satisfying click. A boundary, finally, being drawn around the two of us, shutting the rest of the world out. There was no more ambiguity. There were no more pretexts. I led him to the bedroom, and we undressed, not with frantic passion, but with a quiet, reverent care. We got into bed, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. There was no hesitation. There were no unspoken questions. There was only the quiet, profound peace of finally being home. We didn't talk much more that night. We didn't need to. The most important things had already been said. We just held each other, two halves of a whole that had finally found their way back together. I fell asleep listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, a rhythm that was no longer a source of anxiety, but the sound of my own personal peace. The new normal began the next morning. It began with the sun slanting through the blinds, with the smell of coffee, with the comfortable weight of his arm still draped over me. It began with him waking up and smiling at me, a real, unguarded smile, and kissing me before either of us had even spoken a word. The days that followed were a process of rediscovery, of learning a new language together. The language of us, it was in the small things. The way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom without asking. The way my apartment slowly filled with his belongings, a stray hoodie, a book, his laptop on the corner of my desk. He started working from my place more often, tapping away at his keyboard while I edited photos, the quiet clicks of our respective crafts, a comfortable domestic soundtrack. The rituals that had once been so fraught with tension and ambiguity were transformed. Cuddling on the couch was no longer a prelude to a night of anxiety, but a simple, joyful expression of affection. We would hold hands while watching a movie, his fingers intertwined with mine, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The fear that had been my constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady certainty. The constant internal analysis, the desperate search for meaning in every gesture, simply ceased. I no longer had to wonder what he was thinking, because he told me. He told me with words, with soft kisses in the middle of the day, with the way he would look at me across the room, his eyes full of a tenderness I had once only dreamed of. One afternoon, I was in my darkroom, the red light casting an eerie glow over everything. I was developing the photos I had taken over the years, the secret museum of him. He came in, a silhouette in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Working," I said, carefully agitating a tray of developer. He came to stand beside me, watching as an image of himself, laughing on the college quad 10 years ago, slowly emerged on the paper. "I remember that day," he said quietly. "You were always there with that camera." I glanced at him. "I was trying to figure you out," I admitted. He smiled, a soft, knowing smile. He reached out and took the dripping photograph from the tongs, holding it up in the dim red light. "Did you?" I looked from the laughing boy in the picture to the man standing beside me, his face open and full of love. "I think so," I said. It just took a while for the picture to develop. He leaned over and kissed me, the chemical scent of the darkroom mixing with the familiar, comforting scent of him. It was a perfect moment, a single, beautifully composed frame in the new life we were building together. We learned to navigate the storms, too. His job was still stressful, the world outside my apartment still demanding. But now, when he came home looking like a soldier from a war zone, he didn't collapse in silence. He came to me and he talked. He would pace my living room, running his hands through his hair, and tell me about the impossible client, the delayed flight, the crushing pressure. And I would listen. And then he would wrap his arms around me and bury his face in my neck and just breathe. I was still his harbor, but it was no longer a secret. It was our shared space, a place we had built together, fortified by honesty and mutual vulnerability. The "I wasn't asking" moment, the one that had been born of such pain and desperation, became a strange touchstone for us. It was the moment the dam had broken, the moment that had forced us into a terrifying but necessary honesty. It was the ugliest and most beautiful moment of our story, the point where everything could have been lost, and instead, everything was found. Some nights, I still wake up and find him watching me, a pensive look on his face. "What is it?" I'll whisper into the dark. He'll shake his head, a small smile on his lips. "Nothing," he'll say, pulling me closer. "Just making sure this is real." And I'll let him hold me, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my back, and I know that it is. It's as real as the weight of his body against mine, as real as the warmth of his breath on my neck, as real as the quiet peace that has finally settled in my heart. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and there are moments that arrive like a battering ram, shattering the doors you thought were sealed forever. Our story had both. It had the quiet, creeping intimacy of a shared sofa and the violent, desperate honesty of a forced embrace. It was a decade of silence, and then a single, shouted confession. It was a love that grew in the dark, like a photograph, slowly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to come into the light. And now, here in the quiet of our shared bed, in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, we were finally home. The storm had passed, and we had found our harbor, not in a place, but in each other.